On November 17, 1978, at approximately 11:43 p.m., a woman named Catherine Hayes stood in the bathroom of the Carlisle Hotel in Manhattan, staring at a leather toiletry bag that would unravel her entire life. She had been married for exactly 7 hours and 26 minutes. Her husband, Thomas Hayes, was asleep in the next room, exhausted from a day that had begun with vows at St. Patrick's Cathedral and ended with champagne toasts from 200 guests who had no idea they'd just witnessed the wedding of a Soviet intelligence officer. Inside that toiletry bag, hidden beneath a false bottom, Catherine had discovered while searching for aspirin were items that would force her to choose between the man she loved and the country she'd sworn to protect. A Minox camera smaller than her palm, 3 rolls of undeveloped film, a code book disguised as the address book with entries written in Russian, and a passport with Thomas's photograph, but a different name, Dmitry Volkov, issued in Moscow, dated 1971. By the time the sun rose over Central Park 8 hours later, Catherine would have made a decision that would define the next 16 years of her life. Compromise 2 intelligence agencies, Catherine Ann Porter met Thomas Michael Hayes on April 14, 1977, at a diplomatic reception held on the 3rd floor of the State Department building in Washington, D.C. The event was one of dozens she attended each month as part of her position as a junior analyst in the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs, a role she'd held since graduating from Georgetown University's School of Foreign Service 3 years earlier. The reception room had high ceilings and chandeliers that cast warm light across delegates and bureaucrats holding glasses of mediocre white wine. And Catherine had been standing near the eastern windows, half listening to a conversation about grain export quotas, when Thomas appeared beside her and asked if she knew where he might find the attaché from the Belgian embassy. He was tall, just over 6 feet, with dark hair beginning to gray at the temples, despite being only 32 years old. He wore a charcoal suit that fit him well, and when he smiled at her after she pointed out the Belgian delegation across the room, the smile reached his eyes in a way that made him seem genuinely grateful rather than performatively polite. He introduced himself as an international banking consultant specializing in European markets, working primarily with mid-sized American firms looking to expand their operations into common market countries. His handshake was firm without being aggressive, and his voice carried the faint, flattened vowels of someone who'd grown up in the Midwest, though he told her later that evening he'd been raised in Minneapolis and had spent his undergraduate years at the University of Wisconsin before moving east for business school. They talked for 40 minutes that first night, standing near those windows as the spring darkness settled over the Potomac. Catherine found herself explaining her work, analyzing economic policy positions of Warsaw Pact nations, the careful tracking of trade agreements and industrial output reports that helped State Department officials understand the economic pressures facing Soviet satellite states. Thomas listened with an attention that felt rare in Washington, where most people at these receptions were constantly scanning the room for someone more important to talk to. He asked intelligent questions about Yugoslavia's experiments with market socialism, about Romania's attempts to maintain independence from Moscow's economic planning, about whether she thought the Brezhnev-era stagnation would eventually force reforms. When the reception ended at 9 o'clock, he asked if she'd like to have dinner with him the following week, and Catherine, who had not dated seriously since a brief relationship with a law student had ended 8 months earlier, said yes without hesitation. Their courtship unfolded across 18 months with a steadiness that felt deliberate and reassuring. Thomas traveled frequently for his consulting work, trips to London and Brussels and Frankfurt that kept him away for a week or 10 days at a time. But when he was in Washington, he was entirely present. He took Catherine to quiet restaurants in Georgetown where they could talk without shouting over noise. He brought her books he thought she'd find interesting, academic analyses of European economic integration, histories of Cold War diplomatic maneuvering. He met her friends from state and her graduate school cohort, fitting easily into conversations about policy and politics without dominating them. He was patient with her demanding work schedule, the late nights when she needed to finish reports, the weekends when she brought classified materials home to their secure reading room and spent Saturday afternoon working through Polish industrial production statistics. By the fall of 1977, Catherine had introduced Thomas to her parents during their visit from Connecticut, and her father, a retired insurance executive with firm opinions about character, had pronounced Thomas exactly the kind of steady, serious man he'd hoped his daughter would find. Her mother, more attuned to emotional undercurrents, had watched the way Thomas looked at Catherine during Sunday dinner and told her daughter privately that she hadn't seen that quality of attentiveness in many marriages, let alone courtships. Catherine's younger sister Emily, visiting from college, had been less restrained in her approval, announcing that if Catherine didn't marry Thomas, she would consider him fair game once she graduated, a comment that made everyone laugh and Thomas blush slightly in a way Catherine found endearing. The engagement came in February 1978 during a weekend trip to a bed and breakfast in the Shenandoah Valley. Thomas had planned the trip carefully, choosing a place far enough from Washington that they could escape the city's intensity, but close enough that Catherine wouldn't need to take more than a Friday afternoon off work. They'd gone for a walk in the cold afternoon, following a trail through bare trees with mountains rising in the distance, and Thomas had stopped at a clearing where the view opened up across the valley. He'd taken her hand and told her that he'd spent the past 20 months understanding that he wanted to build a life with her, that her intelligence and integrity and the way she approached the world with both idealism and clear-eyed realism made him certain she was the person he wanted beside him for whatever years they had ahead. The ring was simple, a single diamond on a gold band, and when he asked her to marry him, Catherine had felt a certainty that pushed away any doubt about whether this was the right choice, the right person, the right future. The wedding was set for November 17th, 1978. Catherine's mother took charge of the planning with the controlled efficiency of someone managing a military campaign. And over the following 9 months, decisions were made about flowers and invitations and seating arrangements. Thomas's family was smaller than Catherine's, just his mother, and a younger brother who lived in Chicago, but they integrated easily into the preparations. Thomas's mother, a soft-spoken woman who'd been widowed when Thomas was in high school, seemed quietly pleased that her son had found someone, and she told Catherine during one of their planning meetings that Thomas had never brought anyone home to meet her before, which she took as evidence that this relationship meant something different to him than whatever casual dating he'd done in his 20s. November 17th arrived with clear skies and temperatures in the low 50s, unseasonably warm for mid-November in New York, where Catherine and Thomas had decided to hold the wedding. St. Patrick's Cathedral had been Thomas's suggestion, and though Catherine's family wasn't particularly religious, the grandeur of the space seemed appropriate for the formality of the occasion. Catherine stood in a preparation room 2 hours before the ceremony, wearing a cream-colored dress with lace sleeves that her mother had helped her select from a boutique in Georgetown, and she felt the peculiar combination of nervousness and excitement that she imagined every bride felt on her wedding day. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of candlelight and organ music, and the faces of 200 guests filling the pews. Catherine's father walked her down the aisle, and she saw Thomas waiting at the altar, and the expression on his face when he saw her was one of such unmistakable emotion that she felt tears starting before she'd even reached him. The vows were traditional, the promises to love and honor and cherish. And when Thomas slipped the ring onto her finger, Catherine thought about the future they would build together, the life they would share, the children they might have, the quiet, accumulated years of partnership that marriage represented. The reception was held at the Plaza Hotel in a ballroom with windows overlooking Central Park. There were toasts from Catherine's father and Thomas's brother and Catherine's college roommate, all of them striking the right balance between humor and sentiment. There was dancing, Catherine's mother weeping quietly during the father-daughter dance, Thomas's mother looking on with satisfaction. There was cake and champagne, and the warm noise of conversation that comes from gathering people who genuinely care about the couple being celebrated. Catherine moved through it all feeling slightly outside herself, aware that this day marked a threshold she was crossing, that when she woke up tomorrow morning, she would be someone's wife, that her life was beginning its next chapter. At 11:17 that evening, Catherine and Thomas left the reception and took a car to the Carlisle Hotel on the Upper East Side, where Thomas had reserved a suite for their wedding night before they flew to Paris for their honeymoon the following afternoon. Catherine sat beside him in the back seat, her hand in his, watching the city lights blur past the windows, and she felt grateful and hopeful and certain that she had chosen well, that the man beside her was exactly who he appeared to be, and that their future together would be everything she'd imagined it could be. The suite at the Carlisle Hotel occupied a corner of the 14th floor, with windows facing both Madison Avenue and East 76th Street. Thomas had carried Catherine across the threshold in a gesture that felt simultaneously traditional and slightly ironic, both of them laughing as he set her down in the entryway of rooms decorated in muted golds and creams. They'd opened a bottle of champagne that had been waiting for them, sat together on the sofa talking about the reception, about how Catherine's cousin had drunk too much and made an embarrassing toast, about how Thomas's mother had cried during the ceremony despite claiming she never cried at weddings. By 1:15 in the morning, Thomas had fallen asleep, exhausted from the accumulated stress of the day, and Catherine had lain beside him for 20 minutes, too keyed up to sleep, her mind still processing the fact that she was now married, that the day she'd been planning for 9 months was over, that tomorrow they would fly to Paris and begin the actual work of being husband and wife. At 1:37, Catherine got out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake Thomas. She went to the bathroom, a spacious marble-tiled room with a separate shower and bathtub, and closed the door before turning on the light. The brightness made her squint after the darkness of the bedroom, and she stood at the sink for a moment, looking at her reflection, still wearing the silk nightgown she'd changed into after removing her wedding dress. She felt the beginning of a headache forming behind her eyes, the result of too much champagne and too little food and the emotional intensity of the past 12 hours, and she opened the medicine cabinet looking for aspirin. The cabinet was empty except for hotel-provided toiletries, small bottles of shampoo and conditioner, and lotion. Catherine remembered that Thomas had brought his toiletry bag with him, a leather case she'd given him the previous Christmas. She found it on the counter beside the sink, a brown leather bag approximately 10 inches long and 6 inches wide, with a zippered main compartment and several smaller pockets. She unzipped it, looking for the bottle of ibuprofen she knew Thomas kept with his travel items. The bag contained the usual things: a razor, shaving cream, a toothbrush, toothpaste, deodorant, cologne. Catherine pushed these items aside, checking the bottom of the bag, and her fingers touched something that felt wrong. The bottom of the bag felt higher than it should have been, as if there was a layer beneath the main compartment. She pressed down and felt the false bottom give slightly, revealing a hidden space underneath. Catherine's hand stopped moving. She stood very still in the bright bathroom light, aware that she had just crossed some threshold she didn't fully understand. The reasonable part of her mind suggested that maybe Thomas kept valuables in this hidden compartment, that it was simply a security feature of an expensive toiletry bag. But her training at the State Department, the counterintelligence briefing she'd attended as part of her security clearance process, told her that hidden compartments were not for valuables. They were for things that needed to be concealed. She removed all the items from the main compartment, setting them carefully on the counter in the order she'd found them. Then she examined the false bottom more closely, finding a small tab along one edge that allowed her to lift the entire panel out. Beneath it was a space approximately 2 inches deep, and inside that space were items that made Catherine's breathing change rhythm. The first thing she saw was a camera, smaller than any camera she'd ever seen in civilian use. It was a Minox B, recognizable from the counterintelligence training she'd received during her first year at State, when analysts with security clearances were taught to identify surveillance equipment. The Minox was approximately 4 inches long and 1 inch wide, designed to photograph documents covertly, and it was standard equipment for intelligence operatives on both sides of the Cold War divide. Catherine picked it up with fingers that had started to shake slightly, turning it over, confirming what she already knew. This was not a camera a banking consultant would own, not a camera anyone would own unless they were photographing things they weren't supposed to photograph. Beside the camera were 3 rolls of undeveloped film, each in a small canister marked only with numbers that meant nothing to Catherine. She picked up one of the canisters, held it up to the light as if she might be able to see through the metal to whatever images were captured inside, then set it back down. Her mind was beginning to move through possibilities, trying to find an innocent explanation and failing to locate one. The third item was a small book, approximately 3 inches by 5 inches, bound in dark leather. Catherine opened it and found what appeared to be an address book with names and phone numbers listed alphabetically. But the names were written in Cyrillic script, the alphabet used for Russian, and the phone numbers didn't follow American formatting. She turned pages, seeing entry after entry, recognizing the handwriting as Thomas's despite the foreign alphabet, and she felt something cold settling in her chest. The fourth item was a passport. Catherine picked it up, opened it, and saw Thomas's photograph staring back at her from a document that identified him as Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov, citizen of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, issued in Moscow on March 12, 1971. The photograph was younger than the Thomas she knew, but unmistakably the same person. The passport had stamps from various countries, exits and entries that tracked a different life than the one Thomas had told her about, a life that originated not in Minneapolis, but in Moscow. Catherine set the passport down on the counter beside the other items and gripped the edge of the sink. The bathroom suddenly felt too small, too bright, too close. She could hear her own breathing, rapid and shallow, and she could feel her heart beating against her ribs. The headache that had been forming earlier was now a sharp pain behind her eyes, and she realized distantly that she was going into shock, that her body was responding to information her mind was still trying to process. She looked at the items again, arranged on the white marble counter like evidence at a crime scene. A Minox camera used for document photography, undeveloped film, a code book written in Russian, a Soviet passport with Thomas's face and a different name. The implications were not subtle. The man she had married 7 hours ago was not who he claimed to be. The life story he had told her, the childhood in Minneapolis, the education at Wisconsin, the career in international banking, all of it was fabrication. Thomas Hayes did not exist except as a cover identity for someone named Dmitry Volkov, and Dmitry Volkov, based on the equipment in front of her, was a Soviet intelligence officer operating in the United States. Catherine's training told her what she should do. She should leave the bathroom immediately, leave the hotel, go directly to the nearest FBI field office, report what she'd found. She should not confront Thomas, because confronting a foreign intelligence officer was dangerous and unpredictable. She should not touch any of the items further because they were evidence that needed to be preserved and analyzed. She should not delay because every moment of delay was a moment Thomas could use to flee or to destroy evidence or to contact his handlers. But Catherine did none of these things. Instead, she stood in that bathroom, staring at the items on the counter, and she thought about the past 18 months. She thought about their first conversation at the State Department reception, about the way Thomas had listened to her talk about her work, about the questions he'd asked. She thought about the books he'd given her, all of them related to her analytical focus on Eastern European economics. She thought about how patient he'd been with her schedule, how understanding about her need to work late nights and weekends. She thought about how easily he'd integrated into her circle of friends and colleagues, all of them people with security clearances, all of them people with access to classified information. And she thought about earlier that evening, about standing at the altar in St. Patrick's Cathedral, about the expression on Thomas's face when he'd seen her in her wedding dress, about the vows they'd exchanged. She thought about whether that emotion had been real or performed, whether the past 18 months had contained any genuine feeling, or whether it had all been operational theater, whether she had been targeted and cultivated and recruited without ever realizing she was being played. Catherine put the items back in the hidden compartment exactly as she'd found them, replaced the false bottom, and repacked the toiletry bag with its ordinary contents. She closed the bag, zipped it, and returned it to its place on the counter. She found the hotel-provided aspirin in a small basket she'd overlooked earlier, took 3 tablets with water from the tap, and turned off the bathroom light. She walked back to the bedroom in darkness, guided by the ambient light from the city coming through the windows. Thomas was still asleep, lying on his side, his breathing deep and even. Catherine stood beside the bed for a long moment, looking at him, trying to reconcile the man she thought she knew with the reality of what she'd just discovered. Then she got into bed carefully, lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, and began calculating what she would do when morning came. Catherine woke at 7:15 on November 18th to find Thomas already awake, looking at her with an expression that might have been genuine contentment or years of training in deception. The morning light was gray and diffused. Thomas leaned down to kiss her forehead, and Catherine responded with what she hoped was appropriate newlywed affection while her mind remained coldly analytical. They ordered breakfast from room service and discussed their plan for the day. Their flight to Paris wasn't until 4:30 that afternoon. Thomas suggested they walk through Central Park, maybe visit the Museum of Modern Art. Catherine agreed while mentally constructing a different plan. At 9:42, Thomas excused himself to shower. The moment the bathroom door closed, Catherine went to her purse and removed her notepad. She wrote down everything she'd found: the Minox camera model, the number of film canisters, the name and passport number from the Soviet document. She tore the page out, folded it twice, and slipped it into her jacket pocket. They left the hotel at 10:30 and walked south on Madison Avenue before cutting into Central Park. The November morning was cold but clear. Thomas held Catherine's hand as they walked, and they talked about Paris. Catherine maintained her performance, laughing at Thomas's stories, playing the role of excited new bride while observing him clinically, noting the way he scanned their surroundings, the tradecraft that was invisible until you knew to look for it. At 11:15, near Bethesda Fountain, Thomas's attention caught on something across the plaza, a man in a dark coat standing near the statue. Thomas's grip on Catherine's hand tightened almost imperceptibly, and he steered them away from the fountain. Catherine noted the reaction, noted that Thomas offered no explanation. They had lunch at a cafe on Lexington Avenue. During the meal, Thomas excused himself to use the restroom. Catherine watched him pass the restroom and continued toward a payphone mounted on the wall. He made a brief call, perhaps 90 seconds, speaking quietly. When he returned, he mentioned nothing about it. At 1:45, Catherine manufactured her own need for a phone call. She told Thomas she wanted to call her mother. 3 blocks from the Carlisle, Catherine spotted a phone booth and told Thomas she'd make the call here, that he should go ahead and she'd meet him in 10 minutes. Thomas hesitated for just a moment, then agreed. Catherine watched him continue down the street, then stepped into the phone booth and closed the door. She didn't call her mother. She called the emergency contact number she'd been given during her security clearance briefing, a number that connected to the State Department's security office. A man answered, asked for her identification code, and listened as Catherine provided it. Then Catherine said she needed to report a security concern. Catherine spoke quietly and quickly. She identified herself as a State Department analyst with top-secret clearance. She stated that she had married the previous evening and had discovered evidence suggesting her new husband was operating under false identity. She listed the items: Minox camera, undeveloped film, codebook in Cyrillic, Soviet passport. She provided the name Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov. She stated that her husband believed she was unaware of these findings. The man asked if she was in immediate danger. Catherine said no. He asked where her husband was currently. She said the Carlisle Hotel, 3 blocks away. He told her someone from the FBI would meet her at the phone booth within 30 minutes. She was to wait in public view and not return to the hotel until instructed. At 2:17, a man in his mid-30s approached her, wearing a dark suit. He showed credentials identifying him as Special Agent Robert Mills, Federal Bureau of Investigation. They walked to a coffee shop, took a corner booth. Mills asked Catherine to repeat everything, and she did, providing additional details about Thomas's behavior that morning. Mills took notes in a small leather notebook. When Catherine finished, Mills asked her what she wanted to do. Catherine said she didn't understand the question. Mills clarified. Did she want to separate from Thomas immediately, or did she want to continue to Paris as planned? Mills explained that if she separated now, Thomas would know his cover was compromised and would likely flee. But if she continued the honeymoon, she could provide valuable intelligence. Catherine asked if he was seriously suggesting she go to Paris with a Soviet spy. Mills said he understood how difficult this was, but that she was in a unique position to help her country. The Bureau would support her completely. She'd be in contact with handlers throughout the trip. Catherine sat in that booth, trying to process what was being asked of her. She thought about Thomas waiting at the hotel, probably wondering where she was. She thought about their flight to Paris in 2 hours. She thought about the alternative: returning to Washington alone, explaining to everyone that her marriage had lasted less than 24 hours. At 2:43, Catherine told Mills she would continue to Paris. Mills gave her a phone number to memorize, a contact point in Paris, where she could reach someone from the embassy if needed. He told her to act naturally, to observe and remember everything. Catherine left the coffee shop, walked back to the Carlisle, and found Thomas in the lobby looking concerned. She apologized for taking so long, said her mother had been emotional about the wedding. Thomas, relaxed visibly, said they should head to the airport. They took a taxi to JFK, checked in, and boarded the Air France 747. Catherine sat in the window seat, Thomas beside her, and as the plane lifted off, she looked down at the Manhattan skyline and understood that her honeymoon would be her first intelligence operation, that the man she'd married was her first assignment, and that the life she'd imagined had ended before it had truly begun. Catherine and Thomas returned to Washington on November 27th, landing at Dulles International Airport. The honeymoon in Paris had passed in suspended unreality. Catherine playing the role of enchanted bride while cataloging Thomas's movements. The phone call from their hotel on the third day. The afternoon he'd insisted on visiting a specific bookshop, browsing for exactly 20 minutes before purchasing nothing. The dinner where Thomas had positioned himself facing the door. The phone call came at 7:32 that evening. A woman asked if Catherine could speak privately. Catherine said yes, took the phone into the bathroom. The woman identified herself as calling from the State Department security office and said that Catherine was needed for a follow-up interview. Could she come to a facility in McLean, Virginia, tomorrow morning at 10? The next morning, November 28th, Catherine drove north from Arlington, following directions to an unmarked office building. She was met by Special Agent David Kellerman, FBI Counterintelligence Division. He escorted her to a conference room where two other agents waited. Kellerman opened a file folder containing surveillance photographs of Thomas. He asked Catherine to recount everything she'd observed since their wedding night. When she finished, Kellerman slid a document across the table. It was Thomas's real personnel file. According to this file, the man she'd married was Dmitry Alexeyevich Volkov, born March 4, 1946 in Leningrad, recruited by the KGB in 1968. He'd undergone intensive training, had been provided with the Thomas Hayes identity in 1971, and had entered the United States through Canada with carefully constructed backstory. The file indicated that by 1975, his handlers had identified an opportunity to expand his access by targeting someone with State Department clearance. Catherine saw photocopies of internal KGB memoranda discussing the selection of potential targets. Her name appeared on a list of 12 State Department analysts who were unmarried, who might be susceptible to romantic cultivation. Kellerman pointed to a memo dated February 1977, 2 months before Catherine had met Thomas. The memo outlined an operational plan. Volkov would attend State Department functions, establish contact with Catherine, develop a relationship over 2 years, and marry her to gain sustained access. Catherine looked at her own name in a document written in Moscow, at the calculated assessment of her vulnerabilities, and she felt something cold and final settle in her chest. The entire relationship had been planned before Thomas had approached her at that reception. Every moment had been orchestrated, every gesture calculated. Kellerman said they needed to discuss next steps. The obvious course would be to arrest Volkov immediately, but there was another option. If Catherine was willing to continue the marriage while working with the FBI, she could help identify Volkov's handler, document his methods, potentially feed him selected information designed to mislead Moscow. She would become a double agent within her own marriage. Catherine would receive extensive training in operational security. She'd have regular contact with counterintelligence specialists. Every piece of information would be carefully controlled. The operation would be classified above top secret, and Catherine's cooperation would be entirely voluntary. Catherine asked what voluntary meant. The agents explained that Catherine could refuse, that they would arrest Volkov, and Catherine could resume her normal life. But they hoped she would consider the opportunity. Kellerman added that they understood this was asking her to live a lie, to maintain intimacy while conducting surveillance. The psychological toll would be significant. The Bureau would provide support through cleared mental health professionals. But marriages to intelligence officers sometimes lasted years. This could be a long-term assignment. Catherine asked practical questions. How would communication work? Kellerman explained there would be regular meetings disguised as routine activities. How much control would she have over what information Thomas received? Complete veto power. What if Thomas discovered she was reporting on him? They had contingency plans for extraction. Catherine asked if they believed Thomas had any genuine feelings for her. The three agents exchanged glances. Kellerman said honestly they didn't know. Intelligence officers were trained to manufacture emotion, but they were also human. It was possible Thomas had developed real feelings. It was also possible everything was performance. At 12:34, Catherine said she would do it. She would continue the marriage, would work with the FBI, would become a double agent in her own home. If Thomas had targeted her because she had value, then she would use that value against him. Kellerman nodded and said they'd begin training immediately. They'd meet weekly at various locations, always with cover stories, and they'd start developing a strategy for what information to feed him. Catherine left the facility at 2:15. She drove back to Arlington in cold November rain, and when she arrived at the apartment, she found Thomas working at the dining table. He looked up, asked how the clearance renewal had gone, and Catherine said it had been routine paperwork. Thomas smiled and said he'd made reservations for dinner in Georgetown. That evening, Catherine sat across from Thomas at a restaurant table, and she thought about the fact that everything she'd believed had been wrong. But she also thought about the KGB memos that had reduced her to a target designation. And she thought that if Thomas Volkov believed he'd successfully recruited her through marriage, he was about to discover that recruitment worked both ways. The years that followed unfolded in layers of deception so complex that Catherine sometimes lost track of which version of herself she was performing. There was the Catherine that Thomas saw, a devoted wife who occasionally brought work materials home. There was the Catherine that her FBI handlers saw, a disciplined intelligence asset. And there was the Catherine that existed in the small hours listening to Thomas breathe, wondering if any moment of genuine connection had ever existed between them. The operational choreography began simply. In early December 1978, Catherine's handlers identified a State Department assessment regarding Polish economic reforms that was classified but contained no information that would damage American interests. Catherine brought the document home, left it in her briefcase, and mentioned casually to Thomas over dinner that she was working on Poland. 2 days later, her FBI contact confirmed through signals intelligence that the document's contents had been transmitted to Moscow. Over the following months, Catherine was instructed to gradually increase her willingness to discuss work matters, to treat Thomas as a confidant. The materials were always carefully selected. Documents that appeared valuable, but actually contained information designed to reinforce false impressions, or intelligence assessments that were accurate but already known to Soviet analysts. Thomas's behavior suggested the operation was working. He encouraged her to pursue promotions that would give her access to higher classification levels. Catherine followed his suggestions. By 1980, she had moved to a mid-level role with regular access to intelligence assessments related to Warsaw Pact economic planning. The psychological compartmentalization required was extraordinary. Catherine attended training sessions with FBI specialists who taught her how to manage the cognitive dissonance, how to construct mental barriers. She learned techniques for emotional regulation, for maintaining the performance even in moments of physical intimacy. In March 1981, Thomas received a promotion within his cover organization, moving to a senior position that gave him legitimate reasons to travel frequently. Catherine's handlers saw this as confirmation that Moscow considered Thomas's access valuable. The relationship evolved in ways that complicated the clean narrative. They developed domestic routines, grocery shopping on Saturdays, hosting dinner parties, taking weekend trips. There were moments when Catherine observed Thomas and saw something that looked like genuine affection. She documented these observations, noting that Thomas's performance had either become indistinguishable from authenticity or that he had developed actual emotional attachment. In September 1982, surveillance identified a new Soviet intelligence officer, a woman using the cover identity of Elena Rostova. Signals intelligence suggested Rostova had begun meeting with Thomas using dead drop protocols in Rock Creek Park. Catherine was instructed to create opportunities for Thomas to photograph materials that would require him to schedule meetings with his handler. The operation worked precisely as designed. Catherine brought home a briefing document, left it accessible, and FBI surveillance confirmed Thomas photographed it. 3 days later, surveillance teams documented Thomas's meeting with Rostova. In April 1983, Catherine discovered she was pregnant. The pregnancy had not been planned. Catherine's handlers met with her to discuss options, and the subtext was clear. They were asking if she wanted to terminate the pregnancy. Catherine refused. Whatever Thomas was, the child was not an intelligence operation. Thomas's reaction appeared genuinely emotional. He became solicitous of Catherine's health, reduced his travel, talked about the future with what seemed like authentic excitement. Emma Catherine Hayes was born on December 8, 1983. Thomas was present for the delivery, held his daughter with hands that shook. Catherine observed Thomas with Emma and saw something that looked like love, unperformed. Catherine's handlers instructed her to use motherhood as justification for emotional distance from Thomas. They staged a miscarriage scare at 5 months that never actually happened, documented in medical records. The operation was becoming so layered with false narratives that Catherine sometimes struggled to remember which stories were real. By 1984, the intelligence Catherine provided had expanded to include assessments of Soviet economic vulnerabilities that were accurate in analysis, but deliberately pessimistic in conclusions. CIA analysts considered this one of their most successful strategic deception efforts. The psychological toll manifested in therapy sessions. She described dreams where she couldn't distinguish Thomas from Dmitri. The therapist noted symptoms of dissociative identity disorder. Catherine insisted she could continue. In early 1985, 7 years into the operation, Signals Intelligence detected references to Catherine in Moscow Center communications. They indicated Thomas's access was considered sufficiently valuable that Moscow was considering exfiltrating them both to the Soviet Union. Catherine's handlers saw this as confirmation that the operation had succeeded beyond projections. But beneath all the operational complexity, Catherine lived with Emma and Thomas in an Arlington apartment that contained children's toys and wedding photographs. She read bedtime stories. She had conversations about preschool options. And in those moments, Catherine sometimes forgot that her entire life was an intelligence operation. Sometimes allowed herself to imagine that the family she was performing might somehow become real. The beginning of the end came on November 1st, 1985. Catherine's FBI handler contacted her using their emergency protocol. She drove to a parking garage in Fairfax and was escorted to a surveillance van where Special Agent Kellerman told her the intelligence landscape had shifted overnight. A CIA officer named Aldrich Ames had been selling information to the Soviets since April. While Ames didn't have direct knowledge of Catherine's operation, his betrayals had compromised enough CIA assets that Moscow was conducting systematic reviews. Signals Intelligence suggested that Soviet counterintelligence was questioning the consistency of information Thomas had been providing, noting that certain assessments had proven less accurate than expected. If Moscow concluded Thomas had been compromised, they might exfiltrate him immediately. Either way, the operation was reaching its natural conclusion. The question was how to end it. Over the following weeks, Catherine continued her normal routine. Thomas showed no obvious signs of awareness, but Catherine noticed subtle changes. He was more careful about when he photographed materials, waited longer to ensure she was deeply asleep. He made more frequent trips to New York. In February 1986, the situation escalated. Signals Intelligence had intercepted communications indicating Moscow had concluded Thomas's access had been compromised. The decision from Moscow was to exfiltrate Thomas immediately, within the next 48 hours. Catherine's handlers gave her a choice. They could arrest Thomas using 7 years of documented evidence to prosecute him. Alternatively, they could allow the exfiltration to proceed, let Thomas flee, and use his defection to protect Catherine's role. Catherine chose arrest. She wanted Thomas prosecuted, wanted the truth documented, wanted there to be a record. She wanted Emma to eventually understand that her father had been held accountable. The arrest occurred on March 4th, 1986, Thomas's 40th birthday. FBI agents executed a warrant at 6:15 in the morning. Catherine was awake, having been notified. She watched Thomas's face as agents identified themselves. His expression showed surprise, then resignation. He looked at her across the bedroom, and for a moment she thought he was going to say something. But he simply looked away, and agents let him out while Emma slept down the hall. The prosecution of Thomas Hayes, whose real identity as Dmitry Volkov was revealed, proceeded through 1986 and into 1987. Catherine testified against him in closed proceedings without revealing her own role. The court understood her as a victimized spouse. Thomas was convicted on 7 counts of espionage and sentenced to 35 years. During sentencing, he said he regretted the pain he'd caused, that he'd believed he was working for peace. He said that whatever had started as operational assignment had become something else, that Catherine deserved to know he'd come to care for her, genuinely. He said he hoped Emma would understand that being her father had been the only real thing in his fabricated life. Catherine found these statements difficult to process. They might have been sincere, or they might have been a final performance. She would never know. The years after were complicated. Emma was 3 when her father was arrested. Catherine told her that Daddy had done something wrong, that he had to go away, that it wasn't Emma's fault. Beginning in 1987, they made monthly trips to the Federal Correctional Facility, 30-minute visits during which Thomas played games with Emma and asked about preschool. Catherine never told Emma the truth. She maintained the fiction that Thomas had been convicted of financial crimes. The FBI supported this deception. In 1994, Thomas became part of a spy swap following the collapse of the Soviet Union. He was released after serving 8 years and deported to Moscow. Catherine was notified 48 hours before, given the opportunity to attend the airport transfer. She went to Dulles on June 17, 1994, accompanied by FBI handlers. She brought Emma, now 10. Thomas looked older, his hair mostly gray. He held Emma carefully, told her to be good, told her he loved her. Emma cried and asked when she would see him again. Then he turned to Catherine and said quietly that he wanted her to know something. He said he'd known since early 1987 that she'd been reporting on him, that he'd discovered her role through irregularities in how Moscow was treating his intelligence. He said he'd known for 18 months before his arrest that their marriage had been mutual surveillance. Catherine felt her breathing stop. She asked why he hadn't fled. Thomas said that leaving would have meant abandoning Emma, and he couldn't do that. He said he'd chosen to stay, knowing it would likely end in arrest, chosen to continue playing his role, knowing she was playing hers, because the alternative was walking away from his daughter. He said that despite everything, Emma was real, and his love for her was real. He said he hoped Catherine could someday forgive him for targeting her deliberately, and then federal agents indicated it was time to board. Catherine watched the plane lift off and bank east, and she thought about the past 16 years. She thought about meeting Thomas in 1977, about falling in love with someone who didn't exist, about discovering on her wedding night that her husband was a Soviet spy. She thought about 7 years of double agent operations. She thought about Thomas knowing since 1987 that she'd been reporting on him, about both of them continuing their performances even after the pretense had been mutually exposed. She thought about whether anything in their marriage had been real, whether love could exist within structures of betrayal. Catherine died on April 3, 2008 at age 56 from pancreatic cancer. Emma, by then 24, spent weeks sorting through Catherine's belongings. In a locked file cabinet, Emma found documents she wasn't supposed to find. Declassified FBI reports, photographs of her father meeting with Soviet handlers, transcripts discussing intelligence operations. Emma spent 3 days reading through the files, piecing together the truth. She learned that her father had been a KGB officer who'd targeted her mother deliberately. She learned that her mother had discovered this on their wedding night and had worked with FBI counterintelligence for 7 years. She learned that both her parents had been spies, that their marriage had been a battlefield. The revelation reframed Emma's entire childhood. The trips to visit her father, which she'd been told were about financial crimes, had been visits to a convicted spy. The meetings her mother claimed were with friends had been debriefings. The apartment had been under surveillance. Emma tried to reconcile the mother who'd read her bedtime stories with the intelligence asset described in FBI reports. She tried to understand her father as the KGB officer who'd targeted her mother. In the end, Emma concluded that her parents had both been victims and perpetrators simultaneously, trapped in roles that intelligence agencies had assigned them. They'd both lied and been lied to. They'd both betrayed and been betrayed. And somewhere in the middle, they'd created her, a daughter who represented both the operational complexity of Cold War espionage and the simple human fact that even spies were people who wanted families and love and ordinary lives. The story of Catherine Hayes and Dmitry Volkov ended not with dramatic resolution, but with quiet recognition that some questions have no satisfactory answers, that some betrayals are too complex to be categorized as simply right or wrong, and that the casualties of intelligence work include the children who grow up in households where nothing is quite what it seems. And the truth is classified at levels beyond their clearance to know.